Hello, everyone. Welcome to this week's Black Mental Health Matters show, where we engage in conversation to deepen our learning about mental health challenges confronting the global Black community. I'm your host, Erica Dolland, and today we'll be exploring eating disorders in the Black community. Thank you again for joining us with this week's episode of Black Mental Health Matters. Today we're going to discuss an often overlooked topic in the Black community, eating disorders. Joining us today to help us understand this more is Brianne Brothwaite. Brianne is a registered dietitian nutritionist with experience working in various public and private health organizations. She has specialized in an anti-diet intuitive eating dietitian, worked at Montenegro program as a residential dietitian, and is currently at Turn Bridge as an outpatient eating disorder dietitian. She's created a nutrition program with nutrition education, meal support, mindfulness techniques, and motivational interviewing to help her clients create a better relationship with food. She also follows a health at every size, racially inclusive, and gender-affirming model for nutrition counseling. Additionally, she advocates for minorities and their journey with mental health and wellness. Brianne, welcome to the show. I'm so happy to have you.
Thank you so much. I'm so happy to be here.
Fabulous. Listen, I think before we get into talking about eating disorders within the Black community, I think it's good for our viewers to have an understanding of what are eating disorders.
Yeah, so there are actually many eating disorders. There are three that I think most people have heard of or are more prevalent, not necessarily prevalent, but just more commonly known. The first one is anorexia, which is characterized by weight loss, lack of appropriate weight gain, difficulties maintaining appropriate body weight. In most cases, some of the individuals also have distorted body image, and it really looks into restricting food, restricting calories. There are behaviors that can show up for that, like excessive compulsive exercise, purging, or more relatively said, vomiting, laxative abuse, and then sometimes even binge eating, which is eating past the point of comfortable fullness. Then there's also binge eating disorder, which is characterized as recurrent episodes of eating large quantities of food, often, quickly to the point of discomfort. People who are suffering from binge eating disorder feel a loss of control during their binges, and then they experience this rebound distress, guilt, and shame afterwards. Mm-hmm. And, it's regularly used as an unhealthy compensatory, measure. And sometimes there is purging that is engaged in afterward, after feeling all of those feelings and also feeling, physically unwell. And then there's bulimia, which is characterized by alternating dieting, and also binging, and then also purging. So it's a cycle. There's other types of eating disorders. I'm going to quickly touch on them. I'm not going to have time to touch on all of them, but there's also something called OSFED, which is other specified feeding eating disorders. And those are eating disorders that don't meet the general criteria within the DSM-5, which is where they are characterized. So, for example, atypical anorexia, which means that this person could be engaging in starving themselves, but they're not at a weight that is, supposed to be the weight that you would be at to be considered anorexic. And there's different things like purging disorder, where you're just throwing up all the time, and it's in the absence of a binge. It could just be going forward. There's something called ARFID, which is avoidant restrictive food intake disorder, and that looks at someone who is really limiting their selection to only a couple foods. It's actually not fueled by weight loss or fear of fatness or body shape. It's more of like a textural and cognitive reaction with food and how that integrates. And so that's not, that's also an eating disorder that can persist. And then finally, there is one that is not in the DSM-5, but it's definitely very prevalent. I see it in my work, which is called orthorexia, and it's the obsession with proper healthful eating. And it's so fixated on that it actually starts to damage the person's own well-being. Although I didn't cover all of the eating disorders, I think that's a pretty good overview, just as quickly as I could make it.
Yeah, that's a pretty extensive and comprehensive spectrum of what an eating disorder can be. I think when I think of eating disorders, I just think of anorexia and bulimia. But you have brought to my attention the term orthorexia, which what I understand is this compulsion of wanting to be healthy, which I think is so prevalent in our culture right now, with this fixation on healthy eating, gluten-free diet, and no carbs, or chia seeds. Like, it becomes almost an obsession that's drilled into us that we have to intake these foods to be at optimal health. So I think that's really, really interesting. I'm curious, of these eating disorders that you have done such a great job of referencing and going into detail about, which ones, if any, do you find to be more prevalent within the Black community?
Yeah, so an overwhelming amount of studies for eating disorders have focused on anorexia. And that's in part due to that was the first eating disorder that's discovered, and then also due to the population. And actually, in the Black community, how eating disorders manifest are not necessarily operating within this thinness that anorexia kind of like puts forth. Actually, Black communities suffer more from binge eating disorder or bulimia. And those are the more common ones. So, it's definitely hard, because although these are the eating disorders that we're faced with, they're just kind of like behind in the research a little bit, which makes it hard for us to really say. But yeah, eating disorders have been mistaken as having to always have to do with body size and shape, and that being like, the most dramatic changes in weight and shape. Yeah.
And what I'm hearing you say is that's not necessarily the drive, the motivation, if that's for lack of a better word, that triggers eating disorders within the Black community. It's not necessarily this drive to, I need to be thin, I want to look like a model, but there's other factors at play, which leads to my question of, can you explain what are some of the biological, psychological, sociocultural factors that might contribute to developing an eating disorder?
Woo! Okay, are we saying
That's a mouthful. Take your time.
Are we saying this for all people, or are we saying it for the Black community?
Let's focus on within the Black community.
Okay.
Yeah.
Great. So, that doesn't make my job any less difficult. but it does narrow down a couple of things. So yeah, as I was saying before, eating disorders, for the Black community, the research has always been overwhelmingly more for the community that had, the most flexibility in regards to being able to be vulnerable with their mental health and being able to be vulnerable with their eating disorders, which is the white community, right? So when we're looking at that population as the standard, the majority of eating disorder study participants are white, right? And because these studies are being taken in, eating disorder treatment centers, which are overly populated with white women, due to the fact that, also, and I might say women, but I mean, in general, like the Black community is far less likely to verbalize their mental health issues, especially to medical professionals. So, it's really about who is there and who's getting this care. So that's one of the barriers. Another thing is,
can you say a little bit more about that? They're less likely to verbalize their needs and their conditions to medical professionals. Why, do you know, can you say a little bit more about that?
Yeah, I think obviously there are a lot of disparities in healthcare for the Black community. There's not a lot of representation. And so when we think about expressing one of like our inward most, like vulnerable suffering moments with someone who doesn't look like us or someone who might not understand what we're going to go through in life, that's really daunting. I mean, there's also a past history of, the medical field not being so great to, people of color, whether it was, using, what they could for experiments, whatever it was, right? There are definitely a lot of examples I'm sure have come up in these talks before, but it's that stigma we face, right? In our communities, we do have, this narrative around mental illness, right? And it's a sign of personal weakness. Like, there are so many other things I have to go through in my day that could break me, but my eating disorder, I don't want to talk about that, it's one of those moments. So I think that, since there aren't a lot of providers that look like us, it does take a toll. I think another thing is just like, bias, right? Medical professionals, mistakenly emphasize weight as the indicator of health in just about all, all the factors in our life. And so, Black communities and especially Black women actually have a naturally higher weight where they can be healthy than other populations. So let's say we're looking at something like BMI or body mass index, which is basically a scale that is telling you, are you in the normal column? Are you in the overweight column? Are you in the obese column? Well, when they made this scale, it had nothing to do with Black people. It had everything to do with who is the minority. And that has been a white standard. So now we have this white standard of health, and we're trying to fit Black people and colored people into it when that's really not, necessarily feasible. And so, someone who might have a slightly, heavier body weight and be struggling with, something like anorexia where they're restricting. Let's say that they finally get into this normal range and the doctor's like, "Oh, you're doing great. You're doing great," because that's just fueling the eating disorder.
Yeah.
So I think it's a lack of understanding of what a Black body is and what that looks like and what's normal for that.
And it also makes me think about too how seeing a medical professional who again is basing this ideal of what a healthy body is, what it's supposed to look like, based on this white measure from research that has been done with the white body. It also, I think, illuminates this issue of, somebody going, for example, like a regular checkup, and they get their weight done, like a Black woman, a Black male, and the doctor tells them, well, you're quite big here, or do a BMI test and say, oh, you're quite big here. I think you need to drop some pounds. That in itself could trigger an eating disorder where you start to reflect, oh, is there something wrong with me? do I need to change my diet and the way that I exercise? Like I remember when I was 20 something years old, I think it was like a Groupon. Remember when those were really popular back in the day? And I think it was with this dietitian clinic in New York City, and they were going to do like a BMI test and assessment, help you, improve your eating. And at this time, I was fit and I was exercising and running like 6 miles once a week, and I knew I was in good health. I just wanted to get even better. And I went and I did the BMI assessment. She checked my body fat, my muscle mass, and was like, oh, you really need to drop some weight. Like this is, your BMI is pretty high. And I'm just like, there's no way that could be. I'm going to the gym 3 times a week. I'm eating well, I'm exercising. And just because, my body frame doesn't fit within this standard, right, which is already very dysfunctional and inaccurate, was now creating some of these insecurities, within my head, like, oh shit, maybe I do need to start losing some weight and exercising and creating some of these anxieties. So fortunately I was able to talk to my mom, and she was like, don't listen to what that woman has to say. You look great. Keep eating what you're eating. But yeah, I think that's a really interesting point is, we go to these professionals having an eating disorder, wanting help and support, and not feeling comfortable with communicating, and vice versa. We go in just maybe wanting to like level up our health, or in my case, getting an assessment and being given this false information that's just creating, unnecessary, health concerns that don't need to be there.
Yeah. And it's like, it's hard for me because and like I've had that experience too, where I went to the doctor recently. She's like, well, you're a little bit over the BMI. I was like, you might not know what I do.
I'm a registered dietitian. Don't play me. I know these numbers. I know the science.
Several seats. And I'll send you some, literature. There's tons of it. And also, please don't say this to people because it creates. Yeah, it is a trigger, Mm-hmm. And going back to some more of the factors, something that's really important is that, this eating disorder treatment isn't cheap, right? And it also requires time. I've worked in a residential setting, which is basically the setting before you're in the hospital, the setting before you're in the hospital. And it's essentially that people stay there on average for 3 to 4 months. So you're talking about, who has the highest amount of accumulated wealth and that safety net in order to be able to leave their life and not work for 3 to 4 months and feel safe that they can leave their home, receive a time-consuming treatment, and then go back as if that was just, like the vacation they needed for their mental health. There isn't, like, we do know that like white women do statistically work less than Black women. And now, Black women are sometimes the only head of the household. So how are you going to leave your child, your bills, and all of these things to go take care of yourself, even if you might drastically need it? Also goes into different types of jobs, right? Some of the jobs that, the Black population might get may not have the best insurance policies. This is really expensive stuff. You self-paying could be thousands of dollars a day. And so that's also a barrier, like the financial, inequality, and that is definitely huge in getting a treatment. And, of course, you can't really get treatment unless you're diagnosed. And for all of the systematic and cultural factors that we kind of went over, barring Black communities from receiving adequate treatment, it's like a vicious cycle where we're in a loop. It's like I need the help, but I feel like I can't get the help. But if I get the help, I can't pay for the help. And it's like an ongoing wheel. Just not being able to do it.
That makes sense. That's a very fascinating point, and also very relevant is the economics of treatment and the privilege of care, what it comes down to. I'm curious, you were talking to, I know when we were talking before the show, you had talked about something called triggering food responses and mindsets in relationship to eating disorders. Can you tell our viewers a little bit more about that?
Yeah. So actually, what we just talked about with the doctor and telling you your BMI um, is a triggering mindset. But I think, like, when we think about it, I think in terms of the Black community, I'm thinking scarcity mindset,
Mm-hmm.
and I'm thinking emotional eating.
Mm-hmm.
And then I'm thinking like lack of viable, nutrition information. So I'll start with the scarcity mindset. So poverty and food insecurity play a huge role in eating disorders in the Black community. You know, individuals that can't afford food when they need it, when an opportunity opens itself up to them to have food, they are going to binge on it. Why? Because it might be the only meal of the day. We don't know where it's coming from next. We're insecure with our food. Then continuous food insecurity. They actually did a study and they said that people were more likely to engage in binge eating with that. And then of course there's, binge eating disorder being associated with obesity, which is a disease that impacts nearly about 48% of African American adults. So we have this kind of like spiral, and there's always like that historical viewpoint of like people of color struggling to survive and feed themselves and their families.
Mm-hmm.
So all of these things, if I get it, I have to have it now, are really important in triggering eating disorders. Emotional eating, the psychological stress associated with the experience of racism, and that's just one of the things that we're going through as a Black community. But that is something that's unique to colored people, and it is something that has been studied. And so when you're under an amount of pressure, when you're in survival mode, you have this layer of racism, you have this layer of stress, financial insecurity, all of these things coming together, you might cope with food. It might even be how you've grown up. An example is I once had a client who said, hey, when I was younger, I remember my mom and dad worked really long hours and they could barely pay the bills, but I was left eating alone. I didn't have a culture around food where it was family time or it invoked good feelings. What it was the only time where I felt like there was love and care from my parents. Now,
Mm-hmm.
whether that's to be true is up to, the reality of the situation. But I think that makes a point, right? Like if food is our only joy, we might use it as a coping mechanism. And that goes into emotionally eating also.
Mm-hmm. I think we can all relate to this emotional eating. I know I can. When emotions, I think, sometimes we associate that with, being sad or being depressed, or being stressed, or like you're saying, having anxiety is going to lead us to want to eat and consume. But, I think one thing that is often an emotion that other emotions that are often overlooked in eating as well is also joy and celebration, right? I got a promotion. My friend has come to visit me. My son or daughter, won their football game, their basketball game. It's like, let's go out, celebrate, and let's eat, right? Like eating is always at the center of celebration, of joy, as well as those moments where we're trying to cope with something, when we're using food as a way to, in my understanding, is to suppress that emotion, that sensation that we're feeling maybe in our bodies or in our mind, or even as a distraction, right? So I think, yeah, this idea of emotions and eating is something I think that all cultures, all people can experience significantly, but specifically to the Black community, where we deal with just such a range of, I think, much more greater challenges than other demographics, make us, more vulnerable to the overconsumption of food, to deal with our emotions. So I think that's a really, really interesting point. I wanted to talk a little bit about, it's just, growing up, you never heard eating disorders discussed in the Black community, right? Like, I, growing up, thought it was like a white girl's disease. I you always heard about white people or white women, having eating disorders to be thin, to look attractive. And, I know I'm older than you, even though we look the same age. I am older than you, but like back when I was growing up, the thin aesthetic was something to be desired. It was something to be, sought after. And I remember it wasn't until I was like, I think in like ninth or 10th grade, I read an Essence magazine article about a Black woman who was suffering with an eating disorder. And she was suffering with the disorder in silence, and wasn't sharing this with her family, and wasn't sharing this with her friends. And even with quite a bit of the research that I was doing, even leading up to this interview, you still find these confessional articles or blog posts where Black women, I know we haven't talked about Black men, I'd love to talk about that a little bit if you've seen that in any of your work, but specifically with Black women who are struggling with this an eating disorder, but doing it in silence and not feeling confident and comfortable sharing it with family, with friends, and even in the community. So I'm curious if you have any insight or intake to why are eating disorders such a taboo in the Black community, if taboo is the right word, and why do we feel the need that we can't talk openly about this and share our stories with the hope that maybe we connect with other people who are also struggling?
Well, I think it's kind of because of like the myths that we're told, right? Like
Mm.
eating disorders only affecting people who are really thin, eating disorders only affecting women, eating disorders only affecting teenagers. Black people are strong enough to deal with their problems alone.
Mm.
Black women are aggressive, Black men are threatening. Just all of these like different, you know, thought processes. And then we also talked about like not seeing, you know, professionals that look like us in this field working with us. It's going to be really hard for me to talk about my Black body to someone who doesn't have one.
Mm.
And that person can definitely be like, "Oh, that I can validate that you feel that way." But there's only so much that person can really do, and there's only so much or so far that we can go. And I think that something that's really the core of an eating disorder is that it loves isolation. It wants to isolate you. It
Mm.
wants to separate you from joy. It wants to separate you from your support system. It wants to separate you from the nourishment that you need every day. It wants to separate you from feelings of worth. It wants to completely isolate you. And so, this we must suffer or forego this alone just plays right into the eating disorder and strengthening it. So I think, yes, in part it might be because it might be taboo to speak about mental illness in the Black community, but it's also a function of the eating disorder to isolate that person, to
Mm.
isolate the person so that they don't feel like they can. And so it's not inherently something that's easy to come out and talk about. It's that shame, it's that guilt that drives us to kind of be like, well, this isn't really a problem, or it is a problem, but I'm just ashamed that this is going on, or
Mm.
I don't know why I'm doing this. I know it's not great for me, but all of those things already have a hesitancy. And then we add on all of the other things that kind of just make us regress back into, oh, and I don't want to talk about this. I don't think anyone will
Mm.
understand. I'm all alone with this.
Mhm. Mhm. Interesting. Interesting. I wanted to talk about too, we spoke a little bit about BMI, the BMI measurement, which is body mass index. I don't know if we explained that earlier.
Uh,
Um, yes, no, that's okay. I just thought of that myself. And maybe before you answer my question, you want to explain a little bit about BMI. But we talked about the BMI and how in the health industry there are those biases that take place, that exist in terms of measurements of health and wellness of diverse communities. And I wanted to talk a little bit about, in terms of, first of all, okay, so what is BMI? What are what are eating disorder assessments that is used in the medical field to determine even if you have an eating disorder? And I know that's hard because you mentioned that there's such a broad spectrum of what eating disorders are. Um, but of those eating disorder assessments, what do they account for, and are they appropriate for measuring and determining eating disorders among Black people?
Okay.
I know there's a lot of stuff, so take your time.
So the first thing I think we should start with is BMI, right? Like, what is BMI? So it's the body mass index, and it's basically like weight for height, right? And based on where you are, there are ranges where you should be in correlation to those two areas. And so when we're looking at BMI, we have an underweight category, we have a normal category, we have an overweight category, we have an obese category, and we have a morbidly obese category. As I said before, and this has all been kind of adapted by one population of people, and it was not the Black community. So that is kind of like, if someone, let's say someone's BMI is 24, right? That's considered the normal area. But let's say their body's natural and best operating weight is 27, right? So they get to 27, they go to the doctor says, oh, you're overweight, you need to fix that. Then they're like, okay, well, I'll get back to 24. At 24, they might have a hard time focusing. They might be having food thoughts all throughout the day. They might not be able to, be present for things. They might be passing out. They might engage in a lot of behaviors because their brain doesn't have the capacity to kind of fight, for it to survive. But they go to the doctor, and the doctor goes, oh, you've done some great work here. You're at 24. That's a little bit closer to the overweight side, but we're back in the normal, and so that in and of itself is kind of like how BMI can just be one of those really gray areas that are just not helpful. And it also happens within the system, right? Like the insurances. Once you're diagnosed, when you have anorexia, if you're diagnosed with anorexia, typically your BMI has to be below 17.5, right? Let's say you have atypical anorexia and your BMI is 22, but that doesn't mean that you're not restricting your calories or not purging or not going through, this restrictive tendency, just like somebody else who would have a 17.5 BMI. But what it does mean is you might be kicked out of treatment earlier because they're like, well, this person looks to be doing fine, So that's kind of a little bit about BMI. In terms of assessments, as a dietitian, I'm never the one to diagnose eating disorders. And so for the assessment question, every place uses a different kind of assessment. And there are so many different assessments and validated tools. So I don't actually have the answer for that. But I will say, like, in terms of nutrition assessments, which I have more of an answer towards, currently, and I have seen these things, but I've seen them kind of come about throughout time. So one of the things for an eating disorder assessment for a nutritionist or a dietitian would be, food insecurity. Sometimes that's not even a question on an assessment. And that's huge, like I love intuitive eating as a way to get someone to appreciate food and heal their relationship. But if we have food insecurity, there are some principles that aren't going to work. The notion that you should just satisfy yourself whenever you need to, just, eat when you're hungry. Some people don't have that luxury, right? And so that's going to drastically change how I'm going to interact with my client as their dietitian. We spoke about BMI at large and how, that's another thing. Are we taking that into consideration, or are we looking at weight trends? Are we looking at, a more comprehensive way of seeing where this person's set point is, which is the ideal point of weight for your body, where your body will stay. It might fluctuate in a range, but for the most part, it's between those two markers. Your body determines that. And then, personally, I have gone through I would say I've seen hundreds of white women for eating disorders. I've seen hundreds of white men for eating disorders. I've seen one black man for eating disorders, and I've seen 5 black women for eating disorders.
Mm-hmm.
And not to say that I am, a million years old and I've been doing this forever. It's been 2 years, but, there's a huge gap. There's a huge gap for all the reasons that I just said. And I think that, like, it does make me understand why sometimes ED assessments aren't all inclusive if you barely see that representation. And that doesn't make it right. That's a way that we can continue as practitioners to make sure that we're doing the best for all communities, including some of the struggles that we have, or that we're seeing within, different cultures.
Mm-hmm. So, based on your experience as a dietitian, because I know you're approaching this disorder from the angle of a dietitian and food and mindfulness eating, how do you work with your clients to help treat eating disorders? So let me first ask that is, how do you work with your clients to treat eating disorders? And we just got done talking about how the economics of daily life and its challenges create barriers for people of color, specifically Black people, to being able to access care in treating their eating disorders. So what can they do to help address this? And is it even possible to treat an eating disorder without seeking licensed professional in this area? So I have those 2 questions I have for you to answer.
Yeah. So let's talk about how I, in my practice, go about treating eating disorders. So I have something called the Nutrition Toolbox, and I think it's just accumulation of the core things that I think are really needed. The first thing is assessment of level of care. There are several levels of care, but once you find your level of care, then you'll get the support that you need. So, for example, let's say that somebody has, an eating disorder. They're doing things at a frequency where, it's like every day I'm engaging in a behavior twice a day. That's pretty severe, right? Mm-hmm. That person might need to go to a place where they have a lot of structure, right? And so that's what the best part about determining level of care can help us with in that sense. As a nutritionist, I think that, the first thing is nutrition education. Most of the time when I'm talking to someone, I've heard, oh, my eating disorder said that if I eat a banana, it's too much sugar and that's going to impact my life. And I'm just like, okay, we got some work to do. We can have sugar. And it's just kind of like unpacking all of the different lies that the eating disorder tells, with facts, with nutrition, groups, talking about it, going through how the body works. Some behaviors are really detrimental to our throat and our stomach and our digestive system, talking about how the digestive system works. That education helps someone have a better basis to kind of think through the thoughts. Another thing is nutrition reframing. Like, okay, this is the thought you're approaching. Let's talk about the facts and let's try to have a challenging thought that we can kind of, bring into the situation so that we don't just have this eating disorder thought just looming there. Another one is...
More about that? Can you explain a little bit more about that one?
Yeah. So, for example, let's say someone says, we'll use a banana again. I can't have the banana because it has sugar and sugar's bad and it's going to make me unhealthy. Bananas are a really high source of fiber and potassium, which are things that our body needs. And actually, fiber helps to keep our blood sugar in a healthy and regulated level. So therefore, the banana is more of a benefit to us than the fact that it has sugar, right? And so right there, you've kind of disproved with factual nutrition knowledge that the banana is a bad thing. And it starts, and then we start saying, I actually also enjoy bananas. So it's not just providing me with nutrition, It's something I enjoy.
Mm-hmm.
And that's we continue to unpack, all of the different things that a banana can offer us, as opposed to just looking at it as having too much sugar.
Mm-hmm.
And that's really powerful for someone to kind of see things in another way, because again, the eating disorder, it's them and the eating disorder, and the eating disorder likes it that way. So having an outside voice, and that's why therapy is so important during this. Something that's very, very important is meal plan compliance, right? They did a study about eating disorders, and they said that even a year after eating a suitable amount, the brain matter was still not where it needed to be. And so when you're malnourished, you have higher rates of cognitive distortions. Your brain is not able to really have the strength to go through the challenge process, right? So I could do all the nutrition education in the world. I could tell you all the nutrition reframing, but if we're not eating, we're not nourishing ourselves enough. And your body, it takes a toll on your brain, your body, your ability to be present. So yeah, having a nourishing meal plan that is made for you and tailored to your lifestyle is extremely important, so that you're able to nourish yourself to get to the point where you can absorb the therapy and you can absorb the education.
Yeah. Can I ask something too? I want to just circle back. You were talking about the banana as an example, and I think we were talking about this a little bit earlier, but even when we think about our cultural foods, right? Like sometimes there's this stigma that's attached to it, that it's not good, it's not healthy. Food that is a part of our ancestry, of our cultural traditions. And what degree do those mindsets, right, that have been created from outside opinions and ideas about what it is that we're eating, what role does that play in food consumption and resistance? I didn't know if there was some sort of a parallel or not.
Oh, absolutely. And I'm so happy you brought that up. Yeah. Imagine, this is interesting because, when we think about our heritage foods, right? Our ancestors knew what was best for them, right? Mm-hmm. And so when we think about like just going to different countries, right? And the foods that people are eating, when we come here, for some reason, I felt, I'm from Barbados. So we like our, salt fish and cuckoo.
West Indian ancestry right here too. Grenada, yeah.
So we like our fried fish cakes or fish fritters, however you want to call it, right? And then I come here and I'm like, I'm so excited to have my macaroni pie, which is like the best version of macaroni. I don't care what anyone says. But then all of a sudden we start to get into this diet culture where it's like, oh, you can't have that. That has too much cheese. Mm-hmm. You need to use this low fat, low happiness, low happy time cheese. And I'm like,
tasteless, dry, cardboard cheese.
That's not it. And so instead, there's never anyone who goes, well, maybe you can have that and something else. It's always like, that's a bad thing. Take it out of if that's what's making you fat, that macaroni and cheese, the, jerk chicken, the fried chicken, all of that, the white rice. I have never experienced so much hate against white rice than I have ever experienced in the last 5 years. And it's really funny because they have these places called blue zones, which are essentially where the healthiest people live. And what's a part of their diet? White rice. None of them are out there in Japan taking some brown rice. No, because it's their heritage food. And so I think that like diet culture really does break down traditional foods and demonizes them because they're not something that they understand.
Yeah. And I think even to go a step further is, once we start to demonize our food, right, that is connected to our culture and who we are and identity, we start to demonize what feeds our body, what nourishes our body, what gives to our body. By extension, then we end up demonizing ourselves, right? Like there's something wrong with me because I'm obviously eating something that's not right, which then end up just peddling, like we said, a lot these mindsets, these thoughts, these belief systems that just create, I think, antagonism within ourselves. that obviously is not constructive and healthy for our mental health. So yeah, I think that's a really interesting parallel and distinction that you just made. I want to know, just because we're about to close out here soon, what should somebody do if they believe they have an eating disorder? Yeah, what should they do if they have an eating disorder? And then I also want to speak to um, members of our audience who may suspect that they have an eating disorder and maybe don't have health insurance or don't have the funds to be able to, visit a private clinic or hire a dietitian to be able to work with. What are next steps that people can take?
Yeah, so I think the first step is going to a website. It's called NEDA, and they're essentially one of the biggest eating disorder
Meet up,
services.
MEETUP,
Oh, no, NEDA, NEDA.
NEDA. Okay.
Yeah, and that is where you start, just getting information. If you want, you can also call up um, one of the treatment centers. You can call up Montanito, for example, and they will actually do like a screening just to see where you are with your eating disorder, and then they'll give you recommendations based off of what they're seeing as to what level of care you would need and what that would look like. Whether you go about enrolling yourself in that particular treatment center is up to you and the resources that you have available, but at least it gives you some insight, and that means there is somebody there to answer you.
Okay.
And so you can do that. Let's say that maybe you know that there's an issue, and you're just not ready for that step yet. I would definitely say that NEDA is a great resource. But also there are some, books that I think that are really, um, you know,
Please share.
eye-opening. One of them is Not All Black Girls Know How to Eat, a story of bulimia by Stephanie Armstrong. There's, Hunger, a memoir, My Body by Roxane Gay. So I actually have a whole list of them. I can send it to you and maybe we can put it somewhere in here.
Yeah, we'll put it in the chat, definitely.
And then also there are a list of research articles and peer-reviewed articles for people just to take a look at. I will say this, I can 100% guarantee that if we are struggling with an eating disorder, the eating disorder will convince us that it's not that bad, that it will eventually go away, maybe we'll outgrow it. But the reality is that eating disorders tend just to get worse. And then what ends up happening is if we don't deal with it, we end up passing on that struggle that we're having to our children and the people we love.
So what are the signs I should be looking for, that we should be looking for, that even suggests that we possibly could have an eating disorder here and we need to seek some sort of professional help?
Yeah, so if you're really focused on restricting the number of calories, or you're cutting out different food groups, let's say you won't eat any carbs, I think a really good way to see if something's like an eating disorder is if you can't, right? Mm-hmm. So, in this scenario, let's say you're on a road trip, you didn't get to pack what you wanted for lunch. There's a McDonald's in the area. You're hungry, your stomach's been growling for, 25 minutes, you're feeling hunger pains, and something inside you says, you cannot stop there. That's a sign of restriction, right? Exercising for over 3 hours a day, that could mean like walking 5 miles a day, just if I can only eat, or I can only do this if I exercise. If I don't exercise, I feel like I haven't accomplished something and I'm of less worth and I can't have food. Vomiting, right? Intentionally vomiting to compensate for eating or after eating, and doing that in the cycle, weekly, daily, it's an issue. Abusing laxatives, weighing yourself every day, multiple times a day, and being so fixated on that number. Binge eating, which is eating to the point of uncomfortable fullness and then feeling shame and possible purging could happen afterward. So yeah, I think all of those things, if you're experiencing them, and I think they're all fueled by one thing, right? Like, it's just like, I'm not happy with, you know, who I am. It could be fueled by weight. It could be fueled by, that's how we're dealing with stress. Eating disorders have a variety of triggers and ways that they can be fueled. But I think that those characteristics are the things that people will ask and look for. Diet pills, going on every fad diet for orthorexia, like feeling guilty about making a choice. Food has no morality, right? Like, so you're not morally better if you eat certain foods. If you do feel that way, that could be an indicator. So there are so many indicators as to if you are struggling and if that's something that you would be needing to look into.
Okay, thank you. Well, Brianne, you have given all of us just I'm going to use the pun, a plateful of really great information that we're very, very thankful for. And I'm sure the viewers would love to know how they can learn more about you or where they can find you. What are your social media handles? So what can you leave us with?
Yeah, so I can leave you with my website if it's pertaining to eating disorders. It's called eatforsuccess.com. You can type that into your browser, and there are you'll see my face, and you'll see the services that are there. I do have an Instagram. It is actually focused on the other part of who I am, which is a life coach, and I teach intuitive living. So it's Sunflower Babe, spelled SUNFLOUR BABE. It's the most dietitian-y thing ever. And yeah, those are the two that you can reach me at, follow. Again, I am just so very grateful to you, Erica, for hosting this and being like that shining light in, the mental health world. It matters. And I'm just really grateful to be here.
Well, I'm so grateful for you. And we're very grateful to have bright minds like you in our community working in the health field and bringing to the forefront issues like this that are affecting us loudly and sometimes in silence. So thank you so much for your dedication and research and working with people. And it's so wonderful to see young Black people like yourself just thriving and doing well. So we wish you continued success.
Thank you so much.
And for all of you, we want to thank you again so much for joining us. I know you got a lot out of this session. I sure did. And you can learn more about Black Mental Health Matters at www.bmhm.com. And we are so excited and look forward to seeing you next week. Have a great day.